We welcome in a special grouping of Thursday co-hosts, including the mogul, the owner of this establishment, Mr. Michael Hornby.
Good morning, Rob. I liked the open. I think Ian hit it right on the head. I think the badger was extremely badgery this session, so I'm glad it made it.
And your co-host, along with you for the ride today, is no stranger to co-hosting or being cranky, Mr. Michael Hite. Good morning, sir.
Good morning. You know, I was sitting here trying to think of some way to refute those allegations, but I've got nothing.
He was either full-on badger or he was quiet as a mouse. There was no in between this session.
Can you think of anybody who has a better nickname than the badger?
No, I think it's perfect for him.
Isn't it perfect for him?
I mean, it's the scariest creature on the African plains. Not even a lion would take on a honey badger.
Yeah, what do you think, Mike?
Well, don't get me riled up.
That's the story, man. That's the
right.
story. Yeah.
Keep him calm.
Our guest in this segment is the Vice Chair of Finance, Clay Riley, who joins us via telephone. Clay, good morning, sir. Thank you for joining us.
Good morning, Rob. How are you this morning?
Well, I got
Come to my defense, Clay. Help me out here.
Well, not like normal, Mike. You didn't have anything to say. I got nothing to add. We'll get fired up.
We're 2 minutes in and already Hite's taking it, man. That's awesome. Clay, we had you on about, I guess 3 weeks ago. We were talking about the microgrid bill and the data center bill, and I guess the governor signed that yesterday, I'm told, and that now has become law. And I think Mike Hornby was a moment ago saying it'd be good to get kind of a timeline on this bill. If you could take us through the progression of this bill, because we covered the first, seemed 40 days of this session. It never came up once, and then all of a sudden it stole all the oxygen out of the room.
Well, you know, actually, and I think it's great. And just I will go ahead and say you do have two great co-hosts. I like to give both Mike and Mike a little bit of a hard time for various reasons. Each are a little bit different, but they're both great delegates, and they both represent the EP well. So when you look at the timeline on the microgrid, to go back to my timeline, I started on this bill probably 3 years ago. And I introduced a couple microgrid bills 2 years ago. It was 2 or 3, in which began the discussion about how we can begin to capitalize on what I saw was a future need and power demand, whether it was manufacturing, because I think that's going to be the next wave as you see the data centers suck up capacity. I think you're going to see some of President Trump's reshoring efforts begin to pull companies back in and manufacturing back in, and I think you're going to see that you're going to continue to see a discussion about the the power and quickness to get electrons. But if you go back a couple years ago, that's when these microgrids started conversations, and I was in one of the first bill draftings of this opportunity, and it sort of sat a little bit dormant, but there was always conversation about it. And the conversation has continued, and while there may not have been, I don't want to say public conversation, there were a lot of bill hearings, and there was bills that were in drafting and policies that were being discussed around the Capitol, because we have seen over the past 2 years that need for power and time to power really begin to accelerate. I know I've been in conversations and in different companies around the country, actually, who have said, hey, we want to have island power, or we want to be connected to the grid, or we really want flexibility, and we're looking at West Virginia. And so that really sort of was, the ball was rolling, but it just really sort of picked up a lot of speed. I held on to our bill, so I had drafted a bill on the House version along with Bob Fehrenbacher. We held on to our bill for a couple weeks. We knew the governor was working on something, and felt like we could marry a lot of our philosophy into what the governor had and into what the Senate had. The Senate had dropped their original bill, I think it was 581, that dealt specifically with the Fidelis property and some of the stuff that had happened previously. But the House held on to its bill until about the last day. So we dropped ours probably a week before it got introduced, I think on the same day, coincidentally, as the governor's. And so I think that's why you saw sort of the air get sucked out of the Capitol, as you said, and a lot of the discussion. But there had already been a lot of discussion around the Capitol on it. It just hadn't been reported on.
And you had a couple of hearings in your energy committee, correct, Clay? You had a number of I believe, 3 days worth of hearings from professionals and different companies and different people on this, correct?
Oh, we did, yeah. Well before, probably that was 2 weeks into the session. You know, one of the things that's nice about the committee process that it was a little bit different this year was we were able to take topics that were of importance and have discussions around them without having a specific bill being drafted. So when you have a hearing on a bill, it sometimes and oftentimes turns to specific words and how do you change those words, and really about the bill and not always about the problem. Sometimes it's about the problem, but what we did is we had a hearing, or a couple of days of hearings on, you know, data centers and microgrids, and you had everyone, all the stakeholders came in. You had the energy suppliers, so whether it's the utility companies who were coming in, we had testimony from AEP and First Energy. You had the natural gas industry come in. You had the solar industry. You had the coal industry come in. You had end users came in. We had manufacturers who came in and talked about what they needed on their backside and what they looked like. We had high energy using users, existing users in the state. Who are here and how they're being treated. And then you had residential people that were discussed and what's it look like on the residential side, because in the end it comes down to the ratepayers. You had Public Service Commission who participated in the hearing. So you really had a 360-degree view of the issue. And it actually was a bigger issue than just the data centers and microgrid, but it was really about grid stabilization, PJM, capacity, generation, transmission, but how we make it economical and we make it opportunistic for companies to locate and create jobs here. And so that this bill is part of what came out of that in those hearings.
Mike Height?
Talk a little bit, Clay, about why the two issues were paired together in the same bill, that you could have really separated out the fact that we had, SMR, small reactors, grid, microgrids, and the data centers in the same bill. Now, sometimes they need to be paired together, but other times they could be separated. So tell us a little bit why they're in the same bill.
Yeah, great question, Mike, Mr. Honey Badger. Great question. But yeah, so you could have run separate bills for a microgrid. You could have ran a separate bill for a data center. But as I mentioned earlier, what you're hearing from manufacturers and what you're hearing from data centers, and some of the data centers specifically, is they're really looking for time to power. And, you know, if they can connect to the grid, they want to connect to the grid. But there's places where they can't. And, you know, when they were in down around Point Pleasant yesterday, they had Fidelis who was in there. Fidelis wants to run an island power. So their microgrid will be completely independent of PJM. And they will have backup data supply, or backup power supply that will generate off of either natural gas or diesel. And so when you looked at the reason you paired them together is because it sent a message to the industry that, hey, we are looking not only to provide ways for data centers to locate in West Virginia, but we're also giving you flexibility to have time to power, whether you want to go to grid or you want to go straight to or island power or straight to the grid. And that's why you saw some of the regulations that you see in there with the amount of IT load, critical IT load. So it has to be over 90 megawatts. Well, when you're talking about a hyperscale data center, that's what you're really looking at. But what we don't want to do is we don't want to do what Arkansas did that was referenced in some of the debate on the floor, which is where they allowed 1 megawatt crypto mining facilities to come in all over Arkansas and set up in neighborhoods, and that wasn't a good thing. So the reason you paired them together, and to answer the question specifically, is it sends a better message from an economic development perspective that we are working to be flexible, to get them the opportunity to have power as quickly as they can, and to locate in West Virginia.
Clay Riley is our guest here, by the way, Vice Chair of Finance. Did you have a follow-up, Mike Heights?
Yes, and when you locate one of these microgrids or data centers in an area, how does that affect Toby and Edith and their electric bill, and how they get their electricity?
Well, so there's a couple things about that. So one of the things that we put in this bill was there would be no cost shift to existing ratepayers. So this is all new load. So they can't come in, build a data center, take away someone who's already on the grid, which causes other people's rates to go up. So we prevented that by putting a no cost shift provision. The way that it helps is, I'll give you two instances. One, let's say a data center comes in and locates on the grid. Well, if they locate on the grid and they can get there, then that spreads the electricity cost, the fixed cost, so let's say the fixed cost of the transmission and the generation, over more kilowatt hours, which means there's your operational cost essentially would be minimized and lowers. The other thing that it could help is, let's say they go with a microgrid and they want backup power from PJM. Well, there's going to be a capacity factor that they have on there that allows them to say, in an emergency, we're going to take from the grid. Well, they have to pay for that. They have to pay for the at-ready status. Well, they may be paying for the at-ready status, but they may not be using it. So now you have more dollars going in to the electric companies, which helps, I don't want to say subsidize, but it helps cover those fixed costs of the residential ratepayers, because they're not using the power and they're not using the generation facilities, but they're paying for it, which lowers the impact, I think, in the long run on residents.
And last question is, from an economic development standpoint, what does a microgrid and data center bring to an area as far as jobs?
Well, as far as jobs, and I can tell you, I've specifically talked with probably the largest data center company in the world, and I'll give you an example. In Indiana, Indiana built a 1.4 gigawatt data center. That's what they're building. They expect it to be 1,500 data center jobs, an additional 1,500 support jobs. So basically, for one job for every megawatt and one support job for every megawatt. So what's that, what's that look like? Well, you may have 40% of those people be service repair technicians, people who are actually working on the servers and working in the building. You may have 40% of them be just facilities and operations, and 20%, maybe security. And so you're going to have HVAC technicians. You're going to have electricians, journeyman electricians who in Indiana, coming out of high school, working on these jobs are making over $100,000 a year as they start into getting their electrical license. So you tend to see from a major top 1, 2, or 3 company in the world, the information that they've specifically shared with me is one data center job per megawatt and one support job per megawatt.
Mike Hornby.
Clay, the Fidelis project that was announced or talked about yesterday, how big is that project, and is that obviously connected to some kind of power plant, and how big is it, if you will?
So I don't know that I can answer the question on how big it is. I know it's about 2,000 acres in area that they're looking at. But they're using some carbon capture to where they're leasing the pore space underneath the ground. And, I think their initial build-out was going to be a 100-megawatt data center that's going to be fueled by natural gas with backup from diesel, is what I believe. It's probably been 3 months since I've reviewed their information. But it's still going to be a significant, couple $100 million investment down there. Now, they expect that's just sort of that first phase, that long term, as they build that natural gas pipeline in, that they'll be able to increase that significally. And then the other part of that is this, you're leasing the pore space. As one of the things that was in the bill was previously there were 2 microgrids that were permitted in the state, and if you wanted to do carbon capture, you would lease the pore space, but it had to be under state property. So they own other property that they would like to have their pore space under their property as well, or lease it from maybe someone who owns the mineral rights. And so being able to do that, and if they lease it back from the state, that'll be income that'll come back into the state. But It's about, I mean, from a size perspective, Mike, it's 2,000 acres, but I know their long-term build-out's pretty significant.
And this bill, it started obviously from the governor's office. You had yours and Bob's version of it. Talk to us about
who's Bob?
Bob Fehrenbacher, Delegate Fehrenbacher. Talk to us about how coal power plants and gas power plants are connected to these microgrids, or can be.
Well, there's a couple different ways, but I'll go ahead and go with coal. Coal is probably the bigger challenge at this point, and the reason being is it's just not the scale. So back in 2023 in Wyoming, Black Hawk Energy, I think is the name of the company, they did what's called a coal direct chemical looping process to where they could power a 250 kilowatt microgrid off of using coal without combustion, so doing a chemical process that induces it. They're trying to scale that up right now to 10 megawatts. So it is an opportunity, and it's for coal to be able to power some of these plants. Now, that's probably a little ways off at commercial scale. And it's non-combustible, so therefore you have lower NOx and SOx emissions. On the gas side, it's more prevalent because gas availability, especially in West Virginia, is extremely prevalent with the Marcellus and Utica shale. And the way that you can power those are two different ways. One, you can do it through a combustion engine, but the problem with that is right now those are backlogged a little bit. The other options that you have is to use like an electrolyzer, to where they pass natural gas across a thin film, essentially the way that it works, and then it creates an electron, positive and negative, and then it electrizes it. So you have companies like Bloom Energy or Watt Energy that are using these types of fuel cells, essentially, to power. So you could have a natural gas which will feed into those fuel cells, which will create the electrons, which will then power the data centers.
Clay Riley, our guest here on the program. Clay, when this subject got out to the point where county commissioners heard about it, especially in Berkeley County, there was a lot of concern regarding the way this was all going to be taken care of financially, and a concern that the state was taking money, tax money, that was traditionally reserved for the counties. Were you able to seek any input from county commissioners around the state as this bill and the money and the way it was handled was being crafted?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, I have personally I have a great relationship with the folks in Berkeley County, and as well as many of the county commissioners around the state. And if you look at the original bill that was referenced by Mike with Delegate Fehrenbacher and myself, there was significant money that was going to counties, 20 or 40%, I think, in that range. So, as it came out, actually I sat down with people who were connected within the counties, and I showed them the math. And because truth is truth, and there was some that was going to the counties. I personally felt that more should go to the counties, but I'm one of 100, and actually one of 134 when you consider the Senate, and 135 when you consider the governor. So there was a lot of good conversation, and that's how that process works. And they should be down there, and you should have people from Berkeley County advocating and Jefferson County advocating for what's important in their county down there. You have your delegates the delegates carried a lot of water. I remember Delegate Height and Hornby carrying water for saying, we need money to go back into our counties. And so I think that's important. In the end, it's a process, and you come out of these things sometimes that everybody's a little unhappy. If everybody's a little unhappy, maybe you did good work. I think it'll continue to be adjusted in the future, and I say that because we're talking about money that's not there yet. We don't have a first certified microgrid or certified data center in the state, but as the money begins to flow, you're able to see what the forecast is versus reality. And as you begin to see how that's allocating within the counties and in the state, you go back to coal severance, and you look at the coal severance. They modified coal severance for multiple times over the decades. Sometimes giving more back to the coal-producing counties who maybe they weren't getting as much as they should have been, or some going all the counties. So I anticipate, Rob, that you'll continue to see a conversation about that, and I think you should continue to see it. You should you should have that continued conversation, because if you get it right the first time, it's normally really a shock. I mean, in anything you do.
And the second part of the concerns had to do with the zoning of these, in that these data centers, when they go into your county, override any of the local zoning or ordinances that are already in existence. Now, obviously, in West Virginia, most of the counties don't have zoning, so this is probably not a huge concern to most county commissioners, but to the ones who do have it, it is a concern.
Sure, and it should be a concern. I mean, they have to look at it from a perspective, and they have to take a perspective of, good intentions are normally assumed, but that doesn't mean that, all people will act in the appropriate good intentions. And so if I was a county commissioner and I was sitting in that seat, I'd probably be saying the exact same thing. I think that the way it was looked at ultimately was, there's some concern, and maybe we're not exactly thrilled with all of it, but it's better than prohibiting them to come over. I mean, I think when you begin to look at the power and the water that we have in West Virginia, it's almost like they looked at it with coal and saying that coal was a resource that was a statewide resource. I think our energy and our water they're statewide resources, and I think ultimately that's where that decision fell. That not in a perfect world you'd have both, but in this situation we kind of felt like we needed to do what we needed to do.
And I know you're not an attorney, but the thought of a legal challenge has been floated here and there. Do you think that this will be legally challenged, and do you think it would survive it?
Legal challenges happen all the time. Whether it's all, it's part of the process. I do think it would survive it. But I am not an attorney. I'm just a dumb old engineer. So.
Well, that's better than what I am, so don't worry about that.
As Clay reminded us about 1,000 times this session, he's just the vice chair of finance.
Just a man. Just
one of 100.
Yeah. Final minute, Clay. Those thoughts are yours. What do you got?
Again, I was on here last time. I do want to report back. I know last year after this you had me on and we talked about the traffic camera assisted camera traffic enforcement to slow people down in work zones, Rob. We unfortunately did not get that done again this year. Obviously, there's always some Fourth Amendment concerns, and I share those, so we're just trying to find a way to get that. So I didn't want you to forget that I remembered us discussing it last year. But again, I think you guys do a wonderful job over there, and I'm not just saying that because I'm on here. I think that the ability to share the information about what's going on across the state with the people in the Eastern Panhandle is critical, and I think you do a very nice job, and you ask the hard questions, but you're always informed. So I really want to thank you, and I want to thank the people of the Eastern Panhandle, and thank all the delegates with the exception of the two who are on here with me today.
Noted, sir. Noted. Clay Riley, thank you kindly, sir.
Have a good day, guys.
Thank you, Clay.